On a frigid March morning in 1603, deep within the walls of Richmond Palace, a chilling discovery was made. Hidden among the personal possessions of England's longest reigning monarch was a letter, a manuscript so unsettling that its contents were instantly concealed from the public eye. Queen Elizabeth I, famously known as the Virgin Queen and ruler of England for nearly half a century, had not met a peaceful end as often portrayed. Instead, the letter hinted at something far darker, that her death was the final act in a decades-long pattern of calculated, gradual self-poisoning, perhaps carried out by the Queen herself. This was the same monarch who had routed the Spanish Armada, elevated England to maritime supremacy, and lent her name to an entire epoch. Yet, in her twilight years, she had become enslaved by her own obsession with appearance. The very cosmetics she used to preserve her mythic beauty may have become the tools of her undoing. Still, the tale of Elizabeth's demise stretches far beyond mere makeup. It digs into the murky depths of Tudor power, struggles a world where betrayal was survival, and even sovereigns were vulnerable to the schemes of those closest to them. This is not the sanitized version of Gloriana taught in textbooks. This is the haunting chronicle of a woman trapped in the unrelenting conflict between political dominance and feminine ideals. A woman whose efforts to preserve her carefully curated image may have come at the ultimate cost. The evidence doesn't suggest Elizabeth simply passed away. It implies she was methodically destroyed, potentially by her own habits, in one of the most extended and sorrowful demises in royal history. Elizabeth Tudor's journey to power was steeped in violence from the beginning. As the daughter of Henry VIII and his second consort, Anne Boleyn, she was born into controversy, her legitimacy questioned across Europe. Her father's obsession with siring a male successor had already severed England's bond with the Catholic Church, plunging the kingdom into religious strife. By the time she was just a toddler, Elizabeth bore witness to a trauma that would shadow her for life: the calculated ruination of her mother. Anne Boleyn's downfall in 1536 was anything but swift. Henry VIII, bent on rationalizing her death, led a campaign of slander, branding Anne an adulteress, a sorceress, and a traitor. Elizabeth watched helplessly as her mother was stripped of her royal status, her marriage declared null, and her name scrubbed from official history. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold at the Tower of London. There, a French executioner, summoned specifically for the task, ended her life in a single practiced swing. Elizabeth, now deemed a bastard, found herself alone, bereft of title and parental protection, reliant on a father who had proven he was willing to execute the very women he once loved. The psychological scars of this episode ran deep, shaping Elizabeth's identity and fate in ways history is only beginning to comprehend. Elizabeth's early lessons in power and survival. From a young age, Elizabeth lived with the haunting knowledge that her father had executed her mother. Her very birth had been the cause of that tragic death, and she quickly understood that her survival hinged on appeasing a man who wielded the power to end lives on a whim. Life at the Tudor court was an early education in harsh realities. Love was fleeting, power was paramount, and even the most intimate bonds could become fatal overnight. Her father's series of marriages only confirmed these grim truths. Elizabeth saw Henry wed Jane Seymour, who died soon after delivering his long-desired son, Edward. She witnessed the annulment of his union with Anne of Cleves and watched in horror as Catherine Howard, her fifth stepmother, was dragged to her death over allegations of adultery. Each change in queen, each violent end, reinforced Elizabeth's understanding that survival in the Tudor world meant unwavering alertness and complete self-discipline. As a child, she sharpened her skills in deception and self-preservation. She excelled academically, mastering multiple languages including Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, realizing that intellect was her only trustworthy defense. Outwardly, she projected devout Protestant faith, while inwardly, she questioned religious institutions entirely. Above all, Elizabeth became an expert at reading the subtle cues of court life. A look, a pause, a carefully worded phrasal could signal danger or safety. By the time her father passed in 1547, Elizabeth had already learned to wear different masks for different audiences, speak without revealing her intentions, and use silence as a shield. She grasped that power often rested on the thin edge of fear and force. She also came to understand that being a powerful woman meant enduring constant scrutiny, and that personal feelings must be sacrificed for political survival. These brutal lessons from her youth laid the groundwork for her later reign, explaining her obsession with appearances, her refusal to marry, her fixation on loyalty, and the sorrow that marked her later years. Her earliest experiences taught her that even a royal parent could be an executioner. The turning point: illness and vanity. In October 1562, at age 29, Queen Elizabeth I encountered a crisis that would leave an enduring mark not only on her health, but on her identity as a monarch. She contracted smallpox, a disease that had already ravaged thousands across Europe. As the infection took hold, Elizabeth hovered near death in Hampton Court, while anxious counselors quietly discussed the matter of succession just outside her chamber. Though she survived, the illness left more than physical wounds. It stripped away the beauty she prized above all else. Her once admired complexion was left deeply scarred, especially on her forehead and cheeks, by the pockmarks smallpox inflicted. The mask of power, Elizabeth's beauty, politics, and slow decline. In a time when a monarch's physical appearance was viewed as a sign of divine approval, Elizabeth's disfigurement from smallpox became more than a personal misfortune. It was a political disaster. Her once celebrated beauty had served as a diplomatic instrument, used to charm foreign envoys and sustain the illusion that a royal marriage might still be possible to secure alliances. Descriptions from European courts once praised her as having a radiant complexion and skin as pale as snow. That image no longer existed. The emotional toll of this transformation was profound. Elizabeth had always known that her grip on power was fragile, reliant on appearing attractive enough to entertain suitors, yet autonomous enough to remain unwed. Her appearance had been her protection, her leverage, and her strength. Its loss left her exposed in ways that were more psychological than physical. Observers at court soon noted a shift in her behavior. After recovering from the illness, Elizabeth developed a growing fixation with her appearance. She would reportedly spend long hours in front of mirrors, scrutinizing her reflection and testing various cosmetic remedies. It was during this time that she discovered Venetian Ceruse, a lead-based compound made from white lead and vinegar, which promised to restore the flawless pallor prized by Europe's elite. This cosmetic was not only rare and expensive, but remarkably effective at concealing blemishes. When applied heavily, it could completely obscure the disfiguring marks left by smallpox, crafting an illusion of smooth, pristine skin. Her attendants later recounted the Queen's daily beauty ritual, a process that consumed hours each morning. Multiple layers of ceruse were methodically applied to her face, throat, and hands. Over this leaden base, further adornments were added: dark kohl to accentuate her eyes, mercury-based rouge for her lips and cheeks, and intricate hand-painted touches to enhance her features. The transformation was extraordinary. Foreign diplomats once again praised her ethereal appearance, describing her porcelain skin and mesmerizing allure. Suitors returned to the negotiating table, reinvigorated by the reappearance of the Virgin Queen's legendary beauty. Through chemistry, Elizabeth had reclaimed her political dominance, yet she had also unknowingly begun a fatal cycle of self-destruction. The tragic irony was that her transformation succeeded too well. The ceruse did not merely conceal the scarring, it became integral to her public persona. To abandon it would have meant exposing the truth beneath. To continue using it meant enduring a slow, continuous poisoning. In choosing image over health and sovereignty over safety, Elizabeth committed to a daily routine that would gradually erode her body from within. What had started as a way to mask the after effects of disease evolved into a decades-long ritual of self-inflicted suffering, a fatal blend of beauty and power that she would never be able to relinquish. The deadly ritual behind Elizabeth's mask of majesty. Elizabeth's daily cosmetic regimen, reportedly lasting up to 4 hours each morning, involved the meticulous application of substances that, by modern standards, are recognized as some of the most hazardous toxins known to science. The primary foundation of her signature appearance, Venetian ceruse, was laden with lead levels that would shock modern medical experts. On top of that, additional layers introduced compounds such as mercury and arsenic, deepening the toxic cocktail absorbed by her skin. Lead, the most harmful component in ceruse, was particularly dangerous due to its ability to penetrate the skin and remain in the body, building up in tissues over time. Unlike sudden poisoning, chronic lead absorption manifests slowly, gradually deteriorating mental clarity and physical health. With Elizabeth applying heavy coats of this lead-laced cosmetic each day, she unknowingly exposed herself to amounts far beyond what would be considered safe even in today's most hazardous professions. Eyewitnesses described her appearance as more statue than human. Her face covered in makeup so dense, it resembled a mask rather than a cosmetic layer. Foreign dignitaries noted the Queen's marble-like skin, eerily smooth and radiant under candlelight. This effect was achieved through repeated applications of ceruse, layer upon layer, until her complexion took on an otherworldly perfection. Over time, this crafted image became inseparable from her royal identity. Many of her subjects never glimpsed her true face. Her reliance on this illusion grew into a dangerous psychological bond, one that equated the makeup not just with beauty, but with her legitimacy as monarch. As the years passed, Elizabeth forbade lifelike portraits, insisting artists depict her with the unchanging, youthful face sculpted by her cosmetics. These so-called mask of youth portraits weren't simply aesthetic choices. They were carefully engineered political messaging meant to obscure the ravages of age and illness. As her natural complexion became increasingly marred by the effects of lead toxicity, the ritual intensified. Her attendants reported that the Queen needed increasingly heavier applications to achieve the same result, turning the morning routine into something closer to reconstruction than mere beautification. What began as a few delicate layers became an ever-growing facade, one so thick it would crack and crumble throughout the day, requiring constant maintenance and repair. The financial burden of this ritual was equally immense. Elizabeth spent what would amount to millions today on her makeup, sourcing elite ceruse from Venice and rare pigments from distant lands. Her beauty regimen became a major line in the royal budget, underscoring both the symbolic power she assigned to her image and the sheer volume of cosmetics needed to uphold it. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this legacy is the likelihood that Elizabeth understood the risks, yet felt unable to relinquish the very mask that had come to define her rule. A throne of powder. Elizabeth's final years beneath the mask. Despite growing concerns within her inner circle, including repeated pleas from William Cecil, Lord Burghley, Elizabeth refused to reduce her reliance on makeup. As news spread of noblewomen dying from cosmetic poisoning, her advisors urged caution. Yet her answer never changed. She would not face her people, nor foreign courts, without what she called her face. To appear bare was, in her mind, to relinquish her royal identity. The mask had become indistinguishable from the crown itself, as her addiction to lead-based cosmetics intensified. The Tudor court began to resemble a surreal stage play, where illusion triumphed over truth. Elizabeth's obsession with her appearance led her to commission custom-made mirrors, subtly curved and tinted, to present an idealized version of her reflection. These mirrors, imported at enormous cost from Venice, allowed the Queen to preserve the fantasy that her transformation remained flawless, even as her skin beneath the layers deteriorated. By the 1580s, signs of chronic lead poisoning began to surface in her demeanor, though many around her dismissed the changes as the strain of leadership. But the symptoms: irritability, memory lapses, diminished focus, and disorientation matched classic descriptions of lead toxicity. Her once strategic outbursts, formerly used to assert dominance, evolved into erratic, explosive fits of anger that unsettled even her most loyal courtiers. Her daily cosmetic ritual, once a symbol of majesty, turned into a torment she could not abandon. Ladies of the chamber described the routine as agonizing. The ceruse caused painful skin inflammation, which then had to be concealed with even more layers of the same compound. The sheer weight of the cosmetic mask triggered migraines and restricted her ability to show emotion. Elizabeth's once admired smile, once said to enchant those around her, stiffened into an unnatural grimace held in place by sheer resolve. In her desperation to cling to youth, she ventured into bizarre and harmful treatments. She reportedly applied raw meat to her face to restore elasticity, and used mercury-based elixirs in hopes of revitalizing her complexion, advised by court doctors whose understanding of chemistry was rudimentary at best. These experiments only added further toxins to her already overburdened system. Foreign envoys began to take notice. The Venetian ambassador observed troubling signs. The Queen's hands trembled constantly, her words occasionally slurred, and her memory faltered. Most disturbing of all, he reported a greenish hue in her makeup, evidence of chemical reactions occurring beneath the thick cosmetic layers, now visible to outsiders. These whispered accounts soon found their way into the courts of Europe, where speculation grew about the Queen's physical and mental stability. Elizabeth, once the commanding image of regal power, was now seen by some as a monarch unraveling beneath a painted mask. Her appearance once a weapon of diplomacy, had begun to undermine the very authority it was meant to preserve. The queen behind the curtain, Elizabeth's final descent. Perhaps the most heartbreaking element of Elizabeth's later years was her increasing seclusion. As her actions became more unpredictable and her appearance more unnerving, she began withdrawing from public life, limiting access to her private quarters. The monarch, who had once thrived on spectacle, ceremony, and political maneuvering, slowly vanished from view, appearing only for essential state ceremonies. Even then, she demanded that such events be held in dimly lit chambers, where the drastic effects of her makeup and aging would remain hidden. The royal court, ever adaptive, developed a complex set of rituals meant to preserve both the queen's dignity and the stability of court life. Strict regulations were put in place controlling how close anyone could get to her, how lighting should be managed during audiences, and even what subjects were acceptable to discuss in her presence. Though these protocols were framed as royal decorum, in truth, they functioned as a protective barrier designed to shield both the queen's fragile image and her court from the dangerous unpredictability of her condition. By the 1590s, decades of lead absorption had taken an irreversible toll, slowly transforming Elizabeth from one of England's most powerful rulers into a sorrowful shadow of her former self. The woman who had once ruled through intellect, charm, and strategic brilliance now struggled with memory lapses and cognitive confusion. Her courtiers were no longer just governing alongside her. They were managing a sovereign whose decision-making could no longer be relied upon. The physical evidence of her poisoning became harder to disguise, no matter how many layers of paint masked it. Elizabeth's once elegant hands shook without cease, an affliction her doctors ascribed to nervous temperament, though today it would be understood as a symptom of long-term lead exposure. Her once majestic stride had faltered, leaving her dependent on attendants or furniture to remain upright. More painfully still, her iconic auburn hair began to fall away in clumps, compelling her to rely on ornate wigs to preserve her regal appearance. But it was the queen's mental state that revealed the most chilling decline. She began forgetting the names of long-serving companions and sometimes lost track of basic governmental matters. In a particularly disturbing moment, she was discovered alone, speaking animatedly to a mirror, convinced she was conversing with her mother, Anne Boleyn. These episodes, increasingly frequent, were carefully hidden from all but her most trusted servants. Elizabeth's demeanor toward those around her grew more volatile. She lashed out over minor slights, striking aides with her hands, or throwing nearby objects in fits of rage. These violent outbursts were often followed by long stretches of silence, in which she would shut herself away, speaking to no one for days. In her final years, Elizabeth became a prisoner of her own myth, trapped behind layers of powder, protocol, and paranoia. The woman who had once dazzled courts across Europe now stood as a tragic figure, her brilliance dimmed by the very rituals that had once secured her power. The monarch, unraveling. Elizabeth's final ordeal. The mental toll of lead toxicity, marked by anxiety, depression, and drastic personality shifts, combined with the effects of aging to create a queen whose moods became increasingly erratic and, at times, alarming. The cosmetic routine that had once safeguarded her throne now turned into a daily torment. Forced to sit still for hours while battling muscle aches and constant tremors, Elizabeth endured intense physical suffering each morning as the paint was reapplied. But to abandon the ritual would be to expose the truth her cosmetics concealed. Beneath the thick ceruse, Her skin had turned blotchy and scarred, more akin to withered parchment than living flesh. The lead-based makeup had, in effect, preserved her face like a death mask, a grim facade sustained by poison. What made the situation more tragic was Elizabeth's apparent awareness of her own decline. In private conversations with her most trusted ladies, she reportedly confessed to feeling destroyed by beauty and expressed sorrow over the choices that had led to her current state. But the image she had constructed, that of an eternal, untouchable sovereign, left her with no escape. She could not reveal what age and toxins had done to her without destroying the very persona that had kept her powerful. The Virgin Queen, once England's unshakable symbol, had become ensnared in a vicious cycle of self-inflicted harm, driven by the same vanity that had once empowered her. As Elizabeth's condition worsened, the nation began to feel the consequences. State matters were increasingly delayed, while she battled bouts of confusion or isolated herself in silence. Her once deft handling of foreign relations became erratic, casting doubt on England's diplomatic reliability. The once vibrant court turned cautious and silent, its members carefully maneuvering around a sovereign who could no longer be predicted or trusted. The harsh winter of 1602 marked the beginning of Elizabeth's final descent. After 4 decades of slow-led accumulation, the effects had become undeniable. Her legendary intellect faded before her courtiers' eyes, replaced by fragmented speech and long pauses where her thoughts seemed to vanish. Conversations with the Queen became surreal. She would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, unable to recall what she had been saying. More disturbingly, Elizabeth became fixated on death and the supernatural. She began claiming to see apparitions, the ghosts of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and her sister Mary, among others. These visions, easily understood today as hallucinations linked to heavy metal poisoning, were deeply real to Elizabeth. She believed the dead had come to confront her, and she spent long stretches speaking to empty chairs, whispering to the phantoms she thought surrounded her. By this point, her physical decline had become shocking. Her body, once draped in the regalia of power, now barely held its shape. The Queen, who had once mesmerized Europe, was reduced to a fragile shell, haunted, broken, and slowly fading into madness as the poison she wore for power finally consumed her. The final mask. Elizabeth I, and the slow collapse of a legend. Years of applying lead-laced cosmetics had left Elizabeth's skin beyond recovery. Her natural complexion was marred by sores and ulcers that never fully healed, oozing constantly and emitting a stench so strong that even the finest perfumes failed to conceal it. Her once auburn hair had turned bone white, falling out in clumps until only wisps remained. Most horrifying of all, her teeth, corroded by years of mercury-laden rouge, had blackened and begun to fall out, leaving her mouth in a state of near ruin. What had once been a 4-hour cosmetic ritual had transformed into an all-consuming ordeal. Entire days were spent crafting a passable visage, requiring countless layers of makeup to simulate human skin. The sheer weight of the substances caused them to crack and peel throughout the day, requiring frequent reapplication. Her attendants spoke of layering her cosmetics so thickly it resembled a funeral mask more than a queen's face. Elizabeth's appearance had become an elaborate fabrication, reconstructed daily with poisonous tools that were steadily eroding her life. Most heartbreaking was the haunting awareness she displayed in her final months. In rare moments of clarity, Elizabeth recognized the toll vanity had taken. She confided to her closest companions that she had been consumed by pride, and referred to her face as a garden of toxins growing more dangerous with time. These lucid reflections were increasingly interrupted by bouts of confusion and hallucinations, unmistakable symptoms of long-term heavy metal poisoning. Her mind fractured further, and her behavior turned erratic and volatile. She lashed out unexpectedly, throwing objects and striking those around her. In one deeply disturbing incident, she was discovered clawing at her face in an attempt to tear away the poison mask, leaving herself bloodied and scarred. The wounds from this outburst took weeks to heal, necessitating even more makeup to conceal the damage. Elizabeth's final appearance before Parliament in November 1602 horrified even her most loyal supporters. What they witnessed was a ghost of the Virgin Queen, heavily draped in regal attire and buried beneath layers of powder, yet clearly on the brink of death. Her voice was slurred, her words difficult to understand, and she had to be physically supported to remain upright. The once dominant ruler, who had faced down emperors and popes, now stood as a frail, fading echo of her former self, a tragic emblem of the cost of unrelenting self-presentation. In the last weeks of her life at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth's decline accelerated. Her behavior grew increasingly desperate and disoriented, alarming even the most seasoned members of her inner circle. The legendary queen, who had once ruled with brilliance and strength, now lay trapped beneath layers of paint, fear, and regret, a stark reminder of the price of chasing an image that could never be sustained. The final confession. Elizabeth, I's last testament. Even as her body continued to fail and her episodes of disorientation grew more frequent, Elizabeth developed a fixation on composing what she called her final testament, a personal document she labored over in secrecy, often during the early dawn hours, when the palace was silent and her mind felt momentarily clear. This letter, uncovered among her belongings after her death, was so disturbing in its content that her successor, James I, had it immediately sealed away from the public eye. She wrote in a private chamber where only one person was allowed to accompany her, her most loyal lady-in-waiting, Catherine Carey. Carey would later recount the heartbreaking sight of the Queen bent over her desk, hands trembling violently as she attempted to guide a quill too heavy for her weakened fingers. The act of writing had become agonizing, her lead damaged nerves making it nearly impossible to maintain control. But Elizabeth pressed on with a mixture of defiance and desperation. What made the letter so astonishing was its unflinching honesty. In writing that became increasingly erratic and faint, Elizabeth confessed to years of calculated deceit, manipulation, and what she chillingly called a slow, deliberate self-destruction in the name of beauty. She admitted she had long understood the risks of her cosmetic habits but felt trapped, fearing that without her artificial appearance, her authority as sovereign would collapse. She referred to her daily transformation as a ritual of elegant ruin, a conscious choice to die beautifully rather than live honestly in her ravaged skin. Even more unsettling were her suggestions that the poisoning may not have been entirely incidental. Elizabeth hinted at betrayal from within, noting cryptically that some longed to see me painted all the way to the tomb, suggesting that members of her inner circle may have encouraged her dangerous routine, fully aware of its deadly consequences. She suspected she had been manipulated into a slow execution, not by blades, but through vanity, weaponized against her. The Queen's letter also offered a rare and sobering self-assessment of how lead toxicity had eroded her faculties. She admitted to approving policies she could not recall and signing edicts she later regretted, attributing these lapses to what she called a silver fog wrapped round my mind. Most disturbing, she acknowledged experiencing full memory voids, stretches of time lost entirely, during which she feared others had governed in her name, without her awareness or consent. Her final written lines were among the most haunting. Elizabeth described herself as a shadow seated upon a throne, and mourned the immense cost of chasing the illusion of perpetual youth and flawlessness. It was a confession not only of physical and mental decline, but of deep emotional pain. The lament of a woman who, in striving to embody a myth, had ultimately lost herself to it. The death of a myth, Elizabeth's final days, unveiled. The monarch, who had defined an entire era, ended her reign with a grim admission that she had sacrificed herself for the sake of an illusion that had never truly existed. The immediate decision by James I and his advisors to suppress her final testament underscores the explosive nature of its content. The idea that England's most iconic queen had spent her twilight years slowly killing herself, potentially under the subtle influence of her own court, threatened to unravel the carefully constructed legend that had come to symbolize Elizabethan glory. That letter vanished into the depths of the royal archives, sealed away for centuries. In its absence, only hushed rumors and fragmented recollections remained the faint echoes of a truth too unsettling to confront. In the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, as winter reluctantly gave way to spring, Elizabeth I exhaled her final breath in a room that mirrored her tragic transformation. Her bedchamber had become a grotesque shrine to vanity and decline, filled with mirrors that reflected a shadowed parody of her former self, and cosmetic tools that had long since failed to mask the truth of her condition. The woman who had once ruled the waves and outmaneuvered Europe's greatest empire died in isolation, surrounded by attendants too frightened to come near, in a space littered with the very instruments that had helped bring about her end. The last stretch of Elizabeth's life played out like a tragic performance, a hollow imitation of royal majesty. No longer able to apply her makeup unaided, she was forced to rely on her attendants to construct her face each morning. But what they created was no longer a portrait of grace. It was a haunting mask, layered over flesh, that had become unrecognizable. Her skin, ravaged by years of chemical abuse, was more wound than surface, and the resulting appearance was so unsettling that even her most loyal companions struggled to meet her gaze. The Queen, once hailed for her radiant presence, had become a living death emblem, a chilling embodiment of impermanence. Dressed in the fragile costume of youth, her final hours were marked by the ravages of terminal lead toxicity. Seizures shook her frail body, dislodging flakes of makeup and exposing the truth that paint could no longer conceal. Her breathing came in fits, occasionally interrupted by moments of eerie lucidity, during which she would sit upright and speak aloud to unseen figures, the phantoms that had plagued her as death approached. Witnesses would later describe the scene as something out of legend or nightmare. In the flickering candlelight, the Queen's partially masked face seemed to morph one moment, recalling the luminous beauty of her youth, and the next, exposing the ravaged, disfigured features hidden beneath years of chemical disguise. In death, as in life, Elizabeth remained a figure of contradictions, magnificent and tragic, powerful, and doomed her passing a haunting conclusion to the reign of a woman who had become a myth. Even as she was slowly destroyed by the mirror she could never turn away from. The final illusion, Elizabeth I's last moments, and the mask of legacy. Elizabeth's iconic red wig had slipped askew in her final hours, exposing portions of her scalp scarred and discolored from decades of exposure to toxic chemicals. Yet perhaps the most unsettling detail of her passing came in the form of her last conscious words, which revealed that even on the threshold of death, she remained ensnared by the vanity that had defined and ultimately destroyed her. Eyewitnesses claimed that her last clear request was for a mirror, seemingly wishing to see her own reflection one last time. Her attendants, overcome by horror and grief, could not fulfill her wish. Agitated, Elizabeth struggled to raise her trembling hands toward her face, as though trying to feel what she could no longer bear to see. Her final act was to touch her cheek, her fingers returning smeared with the chalky remnants of Ceruse, her faithful mask of 40 years. What followed after her death exposed the full extent of the elaborate illusion that had concealed her physical decline. When her body was prepared for burial, attendants had to painstakingly strip away the thick cosmetics, revealing skin so ravaged by toxins that it no longer looked human. The lead-based paints had mummified parts of her face, preserving some features while corroding others beyond recognition. Those charged with handling her remains reported a haunting sight. Her natural hair was nearly gone, her teeth had decayed into blackened nubs, and her complexion bore the unmistakable bluish tint of chronic lead poisoning. The discovery of a hidden letter added a final, unsettling layer to the tragedy. In it, Elizabeth detailed the devastating cost of her beauty regimen and hinted at subtle manipulation by courtiers who had profited from her dependence, raising the disturbing possibility that the queen had been the target of a long, calculated assassination through vanity. Though she had outlived plots, invasions, and political rivals, the greatest danger had come from within her inability to face aging, fueled by a court that encouraged her self-destruction. Elizabeth's death marked not only the end of a monarch, but the onset of one of history's most effective cover-ups. In the days that followed, James I acted swiftly. Orders were given to eliminate or conceal anything that might tarnish the myth of Gloriana. Most evidence of her deadly cosmetic practices was destroyed, and her cause of death was officially recorded as natural causes appropriate to her age. No mention was made of the decades-long poisoning that had truly claimed her life. The explosive letter, too, vanished buried in the royal archives, its revelations locked away from history for generations. James and his advisors were determined to uphold the constructed image of Elizabeth, the eternal Virgin Queen, the sovereign who elevated England onto the world stage. The darker truth that she had deteriorated into madness, poisoned by vanity, and possibly manipulated by those closest to her, posed a dangerous threat to the legacy of the Tudors. And so, the legend was preserved. Elizabeth's death was presented as serene and noble, a dignified end to a golden reign. The truth, as always, was far more tragic, hidden behind the mask she wore until her very last breath. A legacy concealed, the hidden cost of Elizabeth the final illusion. Though Elizabeth died, surrounded by devoted attendants, and with the world believing she had fulfilled her destiny, The deliberate suppression of the truth surrounding her death had profound and lasting repercussions not only for the history of women, but for the broader understanding of early modern beauty practices. While the dangers of lead-based cosmetics were recognized by certain physicians and alchemists of the era, this knowledge was never widely shared, largely due to the secrecy surrounding Elizabeth's experience. As a result, generations of women continued to apply these toxic concoctions, unaware that they were mirroring a queen who had unknowingly orchestrated her own demise through the daily pursuit of beauty. The carefully crafted myth of Elizabeth as the eternally youthful Virgin Queen became one of England's most enduring symbols. Portraits painted posthumously still showed her with the luminous, pale skin created by Ceruse, not the scarred reality hidden beneath. This idealized vision of Elizabeth became so embedded in cultural memory that even modern scholars have occasionally struggled to distinguish between the woman and the image she so desperately maintained. Her psychological descent and the physical consequences of her cosmetic choices have since offered crucial insight into how power, femininity, and appearance were deeply entangled in Renaissance politics. Elizabeth's tragedy unveiled the double standard imposed on female rulers: to lead with authority while simultaneously remaining physically appealing. Yet the very tools they used to meet these expectations were deadly. Her death became a potent symbol of a system that prioritized visual perfection over the well-being of women, even queens. Perhaps most unsettling is the implication found in her secret, long-buried letter that her slow poisoning might not have been entirely coincidental. The suggestion that certain courtiers subtly encouraged her ever riskier beauty regimen, fully aware of its lethal effects, raises disturbing questions about the nature of political betrayal in the Tudor court. If she was deliberately guided towards self-destruction under the guise of loyalty, her end would represent one of the most insidious forms of assassination ever conceived, executed not with blades or poison, but with praise and powder. The hidden legacy of Elizabeth I's death is a chilling example of how historical narratives can be shaped, sanitized, and weaponized. For centuries, the peaceful deathbed scene was accepted as fact, while the signs of slow chemical poisoning were locked away in private archives, buried under silence and statecraft. Only in recent decades have researchers begun to reconstruct the far darker truth of her decline. Elizabeth's final chapter serves as a sobering reminder that even the most powerful figures can be broken by the expectations imposed on them. The queen, who outmaneuvered kings and emperors, was undone not by foreign invaders or rebellious plots, but by the inward pressures of vanity. The brutal demands placed upon women in power, and perhaps by those in her inner circle, who understood all too well how to exploit both. The Last Mask, Elizabeth I, tragic legacy. Elizabeth's passing signified more than just the fall of the Tudor line it brought to a close. One of history's most drawn-out and sorrowful self-destructions, executed slowly, one layer of makeup at a time, over the span of 4 decades. In her final days, she remained as she had long lived, hidden behind an elaborate facade of her own design, slowly consumed by the very chemicals she believed sustained her majesty, and distanced from reality by the layers of illusion that propped up a long-faded image. The queen, who had once defined an entire era, ultimately became its most tragic casualty, surrendering her life in pursuit of an unattainable vision of timeless beauty and youth. It was an ideal that no human, not even a monarch cloaked in power, could ever hope to hold on to.